This is the Garden of English. I'm Tim Freitas, and today I've got a really good friend coming in to talk with me about how to actually analyze poetry for line breaks, and we'll give you some ways to actually consider it. And if you're a teacher, enact this in your classroom. So you're going to want to stick around and hang out for our conversation. All right, so I am here with my friend Aaron, and we actually met in 2017. We were reading at the same table for AP English Language. That was our library prompt year, okay? But before I let Aaron talk about himself, introduce himself, and get into what we're going to get into for today, I want to just give out a huge thank you for the Garden of English Patreon supporters. You can see their names listed right over here or like up here or something, right? And so we really appreciate you and the support that you continue to offer us as we produce content and try to get awesome people like Aaron on here to give as many resources away as we can to both students and teachers. If you're interested in supporting us on Patreon and you want to know what that actually entails, because there are some benefits to that, you can check out this video that's like right up here somewhere on that direction. So feel free to check that out. And we're grateful for once again for the supporters over here that do indeed support us. But nonetheless, Aaron, I'm going to let you actually introduce yourself, talk about yourself, and then we'll get right into things. So take it away.
All right, I'm Aaron Gillego, and I'm from Pinecrest School, and I'm an AP English teacher. Been teaching for almost 18 years, and I'm an AP reader, as well as I've been doing the AP daily videos with Tim Freitas, and also upcoming in April, we'll be doing the AP Live review for AP Lang. And I reached out to Tim about doing this presentation because um, I love poetry, and I, at some point in my life, wanted to be a poet. And at Pinecrest, I also teach creative writing. And so I always felt like in AP English literature, one of the most difficult prompts that students deal with is the poetry prompt.
Absolutely.
And and I always felt like, if they could just analyze the line break, there's so many things to open up with the poem. And
Right.
so
Right.
that's
No, this
where,
is great, and I think that a lot of times, we kind of excuse the line break for adding meaning, and so I think that this is great to bring it in, and it's another kind of skill that we can bring into our toolbox as we go into the AP exam, which is only coming up in like a month. Now, Aaron, I have to ask you a quick question. I know that you're
yeah.
an AP English teacher. But are you an AP English lit teacher as well as Lang, or just the Lang there? But you have
No,
that lit passion.
I have the passion for lit. In fact, I include a lot of literature in the Lang
Yeah.
course, but I'm a one-trick pony. I just do Lang.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. Well, that doesn't mean that you don't have a huge understanding of poetry, a better understanding of poetry than I bring to the table. That's for sure. And I'm thrilled that you reached out for this. So why don't you actually walk us through here, and we'll interact around poetry and see what we can do to talk about those line breaks.
Excellent. So the first thing basically that confounds students is what's the difference between poetry and prose? And I always tell the students that when you're reading prose, it really doesn't matter how it's written and how it appears on the page. Skywriting is prose. You could lay out the whole novel like of Frankenstein on one single street that's endless, and
Yeah.
and it will not change the way you read that novel
See,
and
I always thought
understand.
I always thought prose writing was the stuff that got paid. Oh, sorry, I'm totally a dad. That was a dad joke. It was bad.
Right, the
I'm
poor
so
poet,
sorry. Right.
the poor unpaid poet.
But anyway,
And
no, that's a great analogy though. The idea of prose can actually go all the way down, an extended
yeah,
street. Yeah.
the line doesn't matter. So when you're reading skywriting, like
Mm,
when you're, anything that doesn't need the line break, it just can be endless. It does not change. You could set your Kindle on different text sizes, for example,
right.
and read that novel, and it doesn't matter how it's laid out on the page. It will give you the same experience no matter what.
Right.
Poetry is different. The how it's laid out on the page actually matters,
Yeah.
and it's laid out that way, with the negative space and with the uh, the margins set and the line break in particular, and even the line spacing for a particular purpose.
Right.
And so when it's published in a magazine originally in that format, it'll always be sort of replicated in that same format, because That's how you read poetry.
Right. I
And
often tell
so,
my students, right, when we talk about poetry, I'm like, poetry
mhm,
is taking whatever you're reading and the imagery and whatnot and turning it into an actual like 3D and 4K fully
mhm,
immersive experience.
yeah. And also think about poetry as a much more sort of fine moment.
Yeah.
And but one thing that we just have to remember is that talking about the line break is that poetry is verse. And what that means is the word verse comes from the Latin versus, which is a
Hmm.
verb, which is how the fields were plowed. That's the to plow the field is the Latin verb versus.
Yeah.
And that's what verse means. And so when you're plowing the field, you go like this,
Hmm.
back and forth, back and forth. And that's how you're supposed to read poetry. And prose, my definition of prose is simple. Prose is not verse.
Right. That's what, that's mine too. I tell that kids all the time. Any writing that's not in verse is totally prose.
There
Yes.
you go. So it's not like it's that's like the most basic definition that I think we all understand. And another thing is that all lines matter in poetry,
Yep.
whereas the line does not matter, as I explained in prose. And so
Right.
that distinction, if you could draw the line between poetry and prose, um, I think that's a good start for us,
Absolutely.
and why how you can approach poetry through
Yes.
the line break. So this is a poem from E.E. Cummings. It's a very simple poem, and you could see he laid it out in verse,
Hmm.
and he's using the line breaks here and stanza breaks, and it's basically a simple, simple poem.
Yeah.
Um, and students, when I first show them this poem, they're like, "Huh? What is that?" And
Well,
they
you know,
take
it's funny
some
because
time.
I use his poem "The Grasshopper," and the kids often
Hmm.
do the same thing. Like, what is going on? And it's very similar in terms of those
Yeah, and it's
breaks
just
and whatnot. Yeah,
the grasshopper is just hopping like
yeah,
this. But this one is meant to be like a leaf falling
right,
going down. And so, here's the variations in prose. E. E. Cummings observed this in nature,
yeah,
and he's like, oh, there's a leaf falling outside my window.
yeah,
It's like loneliness. And he could have written it in a variety of ways in prose.
yeah,
Loneliness is like a leaf falling. And he's like, let me edit that. Let me make it a little bit more concise. Loneliness is a leaf falling. So he turns it into a metaphor. It's
yeah,
like, a leaf falls is loneliness, a stronger metaphor. And then a leaf falls, colon, loneliness.
yeah.
Loneliness, colon, a leaf falls. So it's a poem with one image. It's an image of a leaf falling
Right,
and one theme, loneliness.
right,
In prose, it's not that profound. It's like, okay, yeah, that's what a poem does. It's a singular moment. There's
yep,
an image, and then the image is a metaphor, and there's a feeling that it evokes. E. Cummings decided to do it this way instead, and he turned that prose into verse, into poetry.
right.
And then all of a sudden, there's a lot more meaning in this poem. And one of the things that you can tell right away is that, well, notice how each of these letters don't mean much by themselves. Notice how there's different readings of the poem, like oneliness,
Yeah,
leaf, and there's so many indications of one. Like this can be read as one, or the article a can be read as one. Le in French is the or one.
yep,
A, and then 11 here, 1 1. So
yeah,
even the font here was chosen by E. Cummings in terms of having the serif font.
right.
um, and then oneliness, oneliness, oneliness. And so there's a lot of disconnectedness here. There's a lot of sort of, again, lack of meaning in isolation or by
Right.
yourself. There's alienation or the feelings of emptiness. Um, Now it's all of a sudden, yes, there is this leaf falling. And notice now the poem, because it's read this way, also imitates the leaf falling. Um,
Right.
and it's just so much more than the prose version.
It's a lot. It's that experience. It's that full
Yeah,
sensual experience that's not just described for you with language. It's actually you have to use your other senses to go through it. Absolutely.
yeah. So this is my little quotable quote here. Uh, Poetry loses the fat, but gains back the weight of each word,
Right.
or in this case,
Each
each
letter,
letter.
right? Yeah.
um, and so that's the great thing about poetry is that all of a sudden there are nuances, there's a lot of tensions, there's a lot of turns, and those things are all part of the analysis of poetry, but makes it all the more meaningful for you when you sink your teeth into it.
Right.
So so here are lyrics from a famous song, "A Day in the Life" by the Beatles, and these are just the first two stanzas. And it's a poem.
Yep.
Lyrics are poems, but actually they're also written with sheet music. So they're written with obviously the rhythm of the music
Right.
written. Um, but this is the way it's laid out as lyrics wherever you get like Beatles lyrics if
Yeah.
you want to find them.
Yeah.
And this is we'll just I think everybody knows this song, so I'm not gonna necessarily read these lyrics. Um, but it's a very tragic sort of song about a person that uh, took his own life, right? As stated in the first line here.
Hmm.
So actually, we're going to look at this in sort of different ways it could be laid out by a poet. Like if I were writing this poem,
Yeah.
I have choices as a writer. And so line breaks, the thing about line breaks is that they're not arbitrary. And the writer is in full control of the line break. They have chosen the line break for a reason. In this case, the line breaks, because these are lyrics, are basically emphasizing um, the rhyme of the song and the
Hmm.
rhythm of the song. So grade, sad, laugh, photograph, changed, stared, which are off rhymes, and
Yep.
before, and lords, which is an off rhyme, and car. So there is a sort of it's just each of the lines are kind of uh, there because of the rhyme.
Right.
And so those are not deliberate yet by the poet. So if I were the poet writing this, instead of like this being set to music, I'm just going to make it into a poem. I have choices to make as a writer, as a poet.
Hmm.
And so I'm going to show you different ways that it might be laid out by the poet, like in draft one, draft two, draft three, or draft four, and it's just changing line breaks. So the first one is like maybe I'm going to write it as a prose poem.
Yeah.
And so, okay, I read the news today. Oh boy, about a lucky man who made the grade. And though the news was rather sad, well, I just had to laugh. I saw the photograph. He blew his mind out in the car. He didn't notice that the lights had changed. A crowd of people stood and stared. They'd seen his face before. Nobody was really sure if he was from the House of Lords. So that's a prose poem. And a prose poem is poetry because even though it looks like a paragraph, that prose poem will be published every single time with the end words intact,
Right.
with the margins in place. Like this was laid out that way on purpose, and that's how you're going to have to approach it and say, okay, why those line breaks?
Right.
So um, this version is in three line stanzas.
Yeah.
Let's call them tercets.
Hmm.
Um, and then this version over here is in couplets or just two line stanzas. And then this one is what I'll call exploded verse. Um,
I like that. I like that describer.
and I'm sure people have seen this with like Ferlinghetti poems and just a lot of contemporary poems lay out their poetry this way with a lot of negative space
Yeah.
with the language. And actually, what's great about this when you see these poems is that yes, they're meant to be read like this, but then they could also be misread in other ways. And the sort of the way it's laid out juxtaposes certain phrases together, and it creates other kinds of meanings.
Right.
And so when you read the lyrics in this way, for example, you can see that yeah, I like this idea of exploded verse. After all, this person had taken his life with a gun,
Right.
um, and it's sort of like, and the life is shattered. And
Right.
uh, it blows up on the page.
Yeah.
He blew his mind out in the car, and noticed a crowd of people are over here, they're watching, and the news today over here, oh boy, over here, about a lucky man. And so this is not an arbitrary sort of design, in other
Right.
words, on the page. It actually adds a lot of emphasis to a lot of different phrasing. It's the same words, nothing
Right.
has changed. But when you look at each of these versions, you read them, and there's a different feel to each of these lyrics now. So my question to you, Tim, is like, which one
Yeah.
is your favorite of the four? Or what
Um,
do you think is like most interesting? Or what do you notice as like, oh, I look at that surprise
well,
when you
I
break the
have to
line that way.
I have to say I think I appreciate the last one the most because of how much interpretive meaning that I could actually engage myself with in that particular piece of it. You know what I mean? Like even if you look at the line where it says he blew his mind out, that word "out" is even in isolation on its own over there.
Hmm.
And um, what I also find interesting is, um, if you look at the top part where it says "I read the news today," and then the "oh boy" is also separated. Like it really draws this image into this kind of "oh boy," and it contrasts with the very next line that says "about a lucky man." And the only other time I'm like really drawn towards that contrast of the boy and the man is in that middle one where they're in essentially their little couplet stanzas there, not rhyming
Hmm.
couplets of course, but like the little two line stanzas. Um, when it says boy and then underneath it man is the end word there. But I think that the one all the way to the right here on the screen, underneath where it says a day in the life, that's going to be my most favorite because I think it's the most, the one that will allow me the most interpretive uh, freedom to actually discuss the lines in relation to what's going on in the poem and
Hmm.
therefore the meaning of the lyrics as well.
Yeah, I agree. And I actually had a lot of fun laying that one out. I was like, oh, let me figure this one out. But you could see it even in the couplets, there's now surprising rhymes that emerge that weren't in the original lyrics. Like
Mm-hmm.
some of the internal rhymes that might have been in the song are
Mm-hmm.
now just much more emphasized in the two line, like um, grade, sad, had, even photograph almost has that now same like vowel
Mm-hmm.
rhyme that weren't rhymed in the original lyrics.
Yeah, and
Um,
I'm thinking about this right now, Aaron, and I'm thinking about like
mm,
teaching poetry in my own classroom, and I do teach AP Lit, and I'm like,
mm,
oh my word, I should be taking some poems and saying, hey, let's change up the lines and let's see what it actually does. That's not something like typically when we analyze like line breaks or anything like that, we're like, okay, hey, let's just look at it as is. But even getting kids in there, let them get their hands on it and try this out and say, how are we manipulating meaning when we're keeping the same words in the same language? And can we do anything else with an image like this as well? Um, and I really am like, oh man, that's the easiest way to get a fun lesson into a class where the kids are like, oh, I can try to make my own meaning out of this. Let's see what we can do.
yeah, because then they think about why would I break the line there, and what does emerge as a sort of surprising combination of language. And again,
And
when I look at,
I'm sorry, Aaron, for interrupting, but
yeah,
I
guys.
think about this other part where we see where it says he blew his mind out in a car. He didn't notice
Hmm.
that the lights had changed, right? And
Hmm.
at that moment, like I'm just thinking about how that could totally change my understanding of the poem if I didn't know any more of the lyrics here. Because I'm like, oh, think about a kid who's like getting in the car for the first time, and it's like, oh man, I've got this speed right here, and it's like, oh, this is gonna blow my mind.
Mm,
But really, we're talking about a much more sinister image, of course. But like just separating that out, instead of saying he blew his mind out in the car, it was he blew his mind out in the car, with that
yes,
break to kind of create that pause there, and that totally changes all of the meaning for it, or
yes.
how you can actually interpret it.
Absolutely. And those are the choices now you make as a writer. Like, why would I want to change that sort of, why would I put a turn there? Like he blew his mind, or he blew his mind out in a car. And exactly, it creates all of this other tension. And
Right.
does emphasize that mind. What was his state of mind?
Right.
And that word mind all of a sudden has a lot of meaning in this version of the poem.
Right.
um, and also over here because his mind is by itself,
Right.
and so it's a center to the poem. In fact, it's really in the center of the whole poem. His mind.
Absolutely.
He was not in a good state of mind, um, and in this version, over here on the left, it that's not so teased out.
Right.
And so those choices are an interesting thing to look at. And I think, yeah, having students manipulate a pre-written poem to find more tensions and more nuances, but then to go back to the original and say,
Right.
why then did the writer do it this way?
And I think that
um,
that's the important part to help really get that interpretive moment out there where it's like, okay, so now that we've realized that we can do this, let's go back to the original and say, okay, why would it happen here uh,
yeah,
for an interpretive
exactly.
circumstance? Absolutely.
So I'm gonna go to the next poem. And the thing about um, line breaks, and we all know this, that obviously line breaks create rhythm, and they create tension, and they create turns, and they emphasize end words and beginning words. And here's a poem where typically when I look at line breaks, I tend to look for enjambment.
Yeah.
And a lot of poems that have enjambment tend to read very fast,
Right.
and you kind of go down the page much more fast if there's enjambment. Here's a poem where there's very little, there's only one enjambed line, and it's the first line. The rest are end stopped, um,
Except for the second
basically.
stanza too. Yeah.
The
But
second
even
stanza
still,
is,
even
but
still.
yeah, and that's like a soft enjambment, if I
Right.
could call it that, right? Because there's a conjunction here.
Right. Oh, for
So
sure.
yeah, line breaks create rhythm, and in this case, most lines are end stopped, and only the first line. And I'll agree with you that that second one too, over here, is also in jammed. But let's read. Are you familiar with this poem?
I've
Of
never read it.
course.
No.
Ah, so let's read it.
Yeah.
Traveling Through the Dark by William Stafford. Traveling through the dark, I found a deer dead on the edge of the Wilson River Road. It is usually best to roll them into the canyon. That road is narrow. To swerve might make more dead. By glow of the taillight, I stumbled back of the car and stood by the heap, a doe, a recent killing. She had stiffened already, almost cold. I dragged her off. She was large in the belly. My fingers touching her side brought me the reason. Her side was warm. Her fawn lay there waiting, alive, still, never to be born. Beside that mountain road, I hesitated. The car aimed ahead its lowered parking lights. Under the hood purred the steady engine. I stood in the glare of the warm exhaust turning red. Around our group, I could hear the wilderness listen. I thought hard for us all, my only swerving, then pushed her over the edge into the river. So when I teach this poem to the students, and usually teach this as like almost like very early on in the year, it's like
Yeah.
this ethical question. I ask them, would you push the, what would
Right.
you do?
Does it go over or not? Right.
Yeah. Well, and why would you do what you did? Do you save the fawn, or do you push the deer over? Why would you
Right.
make that choice? And it's a real ethical dilemma, and you get to learn about the students right away in terms of how they think about like animals, if they're fond of animals,
Yeah.
about something controversial as even like perhaps mercy killing,
Yeah.
um, and and or whether or not they care only about themselves or they care about others.
Right.
And it really is an eye opener in terms of beginning the school year and learning about your students in that way. So I always introduce this poem very early in the year. Um, but I also introduce it early in the year because I tell the students that they have to read very deliberately. And one of the things that they have to do when they read poetry is to read with the punctuation marks in
You
place,
bet.
because they are like the breath marks, and they
Hmm.
are the indications of rhythm for you as the reader of the poem. And in this poem, it's meant to be read very, very slowly with all these end stops, and it's meant to just emulate the hesitation and the trepidation and the tension of the situation in the poem.
Right. And this caesura in there is also those end stops and those pauses in the middle of the lines are really pushing that through. And this reminds me of that poem by Hardy called "The Man He Killed," where he's trying to um, the speaker is trying to um, defend essentially why he shot the other guy in the other army when he's like, we could have been friends, and then he kind of just moves, he moves on after. And this could be a great pairing for that. How does that kind of end stop and the caesura really help get into that cognitive process here of our speaker?
Yes. And there's actually some punctuation marks here that I want to call attention to,
Yeah.
because this last use of the dash is just, to me, so perfect. My only swerving, and then there's a dash, and it's like you're on the edge
Yeah.
of that choice. And it's not just a dash; it's a dash with a comma.
Right. That comma that goes over the edge, right?
It really is imitating that falling movement,
Yeah.
right? And it's like, whoa, because the dash is by itself is already that's the longest pause in poetry.
Right.
And so to add a comma to it, certainly it's very visual, right?
Right.
It's falling over the edge. That comma is falling over the edge,
Mm-hmm.
and then you push her over the edge to the river. And so to me, that's just a brilliant use of a punctuation mark.
Even visually, this is great because if you trace the outside of the lines, you've got that wavering back and forth. It goes in one direction, it cuts back a little bit, it goes back out, and it comes back the entire way through. We've got our wavering speaker as well, and then over the edge it goes.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
or it's like the jagged ends of a
Right.
canyon.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so yeah, I always tell them, look at the punctuation marks and see if there's anything interesting worth analyzing. And again, even this brought me the reason with, again, the big dash.
Right.
And what is that reason? And what's taking you so long to get to that reason?
Right. Right.
Or what's that reason attached to? Is it attached to emptiness? Is it attached to, so it's just one thing to look at as well.
No, this is great, Aaron.
So, like I said, line breaks emphasize end words or phrases, and they also emphasize beginning words or phrases.
Mm-hmm.
And so you always, when you're analyzing the poem, then look at some of the end words. You don't need to analyze all of them, but you certainly want to look at end phrases and end words and say, why would they put them, why would the poet want to put them at the end of the line?
Right.
And then look at some of the beginning words that stand out or phrases that stand out, and then see whether or not these line breaks are creating shifts in expectations or shifts in meaning. So the first line is the first experience that we have with it. This is the enjammed line. Traveling through the dark, I found a deer.
Yeah.
Dead. So enjam to the next word, dead. And that all of a sudden changes the expectation or shifts the meaning of that word deer.
Right.
And there is I found a deer dead, and there's a harsh sound to it. There's
Right. And that goes with the dark, right? And also the other thing too is as you're going over that road, he's talking about the swerve, and this is the enjammed line here, which allows us to kind of keep that speed, which is exactly what's kind of going on in that picture here, where he's like, I'm traveling at full speed here, seeing that deer dead, and now all of a sudden he's considering like, oh my word, when this usually happens, if we swerve out of the way, you're going over this line,
Yeah.
And so you have that kind of interruptive, hard sound there. I mean, this is awesome.
And then the other thing I love, again, the decision making process in the poem here, in terms of how he's reasoning this through. Like, okay, notice the tactile sensation here. Her side was warm, and in that realization, there's a fawn in there,
Yeah.
and it's alive. It's still. It might never, never to be born.
Right.
In a way, this line already reveals the kind of end.
Right. Yes.
It's like, oh, what do you mean never to be born? You have a chance.
Right, and then even putting the period there, that sense of finality, even right there with that little period right there, perfect.
Yeah. And then there's another one in terms of like, I thought hard for us all. This one, I thought hard for us all, and then the caesura. Like,
Yeah.
who's us all? And I always ask that question: who is all? and well, the students will say, "Oh, well, it's the wilderness, the trees, God watching, the deer and the fawn.
Yeah.
It's also the other people that might come into contact with this dead deer if you just leave it there.
Yeah.
Other human beings that might be endangered because of that roadkill that it would have to swerve. And so
Yeah.
it opens up a lot of possibilities when it comes to that beginning phrasing there. And so one of the things, yeah, that I would just emphasize to the students is when you look at line breaks, just again, you could analyze endlessly just the end words alone.
Yeah.
And if you sort of run out of that, you could analyze how those line breaks create new surprises with the beginnings of the word, or beginnings of
Right.
the line as a
Right.
result. And then to relate to line break, there's also obviously stanza break.
Yeah.
Why would you break the line and then add another negative space? And why would you want that pause or breath mark in those between those stanzas? So those are all worth considering when it comes to looking at the line break in poetry. And we didn't even get to the idea of metaphor or simile or personification or all the litany of devices that students are apt to look for.
Right.
And here you're just really looking at language and how those words change and add nuance and tension and meaning to the poem by looking at just the line break. So
Right.
to me, why I encourage students to analyze poetry in this way is because number one, it is perhaps the most deliberate choice that the writer makes when
Hmm.
writing a poem. Um, and as we can see when we did the Beatles lyrics, it's just a very deliberate choice. These are very deliberate choices. And because of that deliberate choice, deliberation and choice, you could certainly analyze it because
Right.
it's evident.
Right. No, I mean this is great, Aaron. And I think it helps bring a lot of attention to something that's often overlooked in terms of being able to provide detailed commentary for, even if you're writing about it in a paper. Think about the line
Mhm.
breaks. Think about the words that are accentuated at the end. How do they amplify the words at the beginning, and then also relate to the ideas in total. These
Yeah.
examples are excellent. I'll tell you what, I really appreciate your time here, Aaron. And do you have like a website or anything that people can contact you at? Because I'm sure that people are gonna be asking me questions, and I'm like, oh, I gotta get them to Aaron.
No, I don't. I'm very old school. I don't really have much of a besides the Facebook that I engage with the AP Lang community, right?
Yeah.
I don't have social media.
Right. Well, no, and that's okay. But if I get any questions, I'll make sure. If anybody has questions for Aaron, please make sure to put them in the comments down below. I'll make sure that Aaron finds out that they're there. We'll try to get you to comment on those if those show up. But I appreciate the time that you brought into making this presentation and doing this with us. And for everybody that's watching, if this video was helpful for you all, I'm going to ask that you just did the easiest thing. That's press like and subscribe because that helps support the garden grow. Please note that we got a bunch of affiliate links for things down below. And that would be like study guides, particularly for AP Lang kind of stuff. And there are teaching resources down there, and there are some affiliate links for that and whatnot. You can pick up some Garden of English merch. You can also check out our website, thegardenofenglish.com. And we are active on Facebook and on Instagram. We kissed TikTok goodbye. I just could not handle it. I didn't even like it at all, right? But Aaron, I will see you later on this month because we'll be taking care of AP Live, and I really appreciate you coming on and talking to me about line breaks.
Thank you
Oh,
so
you know
much.
what?
I
I have one
appreciate
other
it.
question though, Aaron.
Mhm.
Are you okay with me putting this particular presentation in the description down below so that people have access to it if they make their own copies?
Absolutely.
Okay, excellent. So I will make sure to put that there, and your contact information is on the front too. So they just do a quick little Google search. If they need to email you, they can do that as well. So thank you for your generosity and your time, and I hope that you have a great day.